The Thornycroft Mighty Antar was one of the best-selling dinky toys of the 1950s and 60s, a tiny tank transporter that children across Britain pushed across their bedroom carpets without knowing the real thing was hauling 50-ton Centurions across Salisbury Plain. At its peak, the Thornycroft works at Basingstoke employed 2,500 workers across 16 acres, building the heaviest lorries in Britain, tank transporters, oil field prime movers, crash tenders for airfields across the Commonwealth. They survived 2 world wars, survived the Depression when the bank told them to rationalise or close, survived the shift from steam to petrol to diesel. And then, after 74 years on the Worting Road, the works went silent. How does a factory that built the vehicles 2 armies depended on simply disappear? What happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. The Sculptor's Son. The story begins not in Hampshire but in Rome, and not with an engineer but with a family of sculptors. On the 1st of February, 1843, in the Via Sistina, then still called the Via Felice, John Isaac Thornycroft was born to Thomas and Mary Thornycroft, 2 English sculptors working commissions at the Vatican. His mother carved queens. His father was midway through the monumental bronze group of Boadicea and her daughters that would eventually stand at the corner of Westminster Bridge, opposite the Houses of Parliament. It was a household steeped in the physical act of making, the smell of plaster dust, the clang of chisel on stone, the understanding that raw material could be shaped into something that outlasted its maker. The boy wanted no part of marble. What fascinated John Isaac was motion, not the frozen drama of a sculptural group, but the live, mechanical kind. Pistons, boilers, propellers, the conversion of heat into speed. At 17, working in his father's Chiswick studio surrounded by half-finished classical figures, he built his first steam launch. He called her Nautilus. She was 36 feet long, and in 1862 she became the first steam vessel fast enough to keep pace with the Oxford and Cambridge boat race on the Thames. A teenager's project boat, outrunning the finest oarsmen in England. Thomas Thornycroft read the signs with a sculptor's eye for form. His son's talent was mechanical, not artistic, and it needed room. Thomas purchased land on the river at Chiswick and sent John north to learn the practical trade. First to Palmer's Shipbuilding and Iron Company at Jarrow-on-Tyne, where iron ships were riveted in the yards above the river, and then to the University of Glasgow. Glasgow in the 1860s was the only place in Britain where naval engineering was taught as a systematic discipline. John studied under Lord Kelvin and Macquorn Rankine, 2 of the foremost scientific minds of the Victorian age. He returned south a trained engineer, took over the Chiswick yard outright in 1866, and registered a company under his own name, John Firth Thornycroft and Company. What followed over the next 3 decades made him one of the most decorated engineers of the long Victorian era. The 1871 steam yacht Miranda proved that small craft could reach speeds previously considered impossible. The 1873 Gitana, built for the Norwegian government, is generally considered the first purpose-built torpedo boat in the world. HMS Lightning of 1877, his first Royal Navy commission, was the first Admiralty torpedo boat, the beginning of a weapons platform that would reshape naval warfare within a generation. He patented an improved water tube boiler in 1885. HMS Speedy of 1894 was the first Royal Navy vessel fitted with one. He worked on hull lubrication by air, on stepped hull hydroplanes, on every frontier where speed on water could be pushed further. He married Blanche Ada Cools at Camden in 1870. They had 2 sons and 5 daughters, and the daughters proved as formidable as the sons. Blanche Thornycroft, born 1873, became one of the first 3 women members of the Royal Institution of Naval Architects. She spent decades running the family's hull testing tank at Bembridge on the Isle of Wight, testing motor launch hulls, coastal motorboats, and the destroyers Acasta and Acheron. The eldest son, John Edward, would take over as managing director of the firm in 1906 and oversee both the move of shipbuilding from Chiswick to Woolston in Southampton and the establishment of the works that would define Basingstoke for 70 years. The Thornycrofts were a dynasty in the most literal Victorian sense. 3 generations, 3 counties, 3 industries, boats, lorries, destroyers, all bearing the same name, and all of it grew from a sculptor's studio in Chiswick, where a teenager decided he'd rather build engines than carve gods. But the road vehicle business, the one that would give Basingstoke its identity, was an afterthought that ate the firm. Sir John had built his first steam carriage in 1862, but the Locomotives on Highways Acts, the so-called red flag laws, which required a man with a red flag to walk ahead of any self-propelled vehicle, strangled the idea for 3 decades. The repeal of those acts in 1896 changed everything overnight. That same year, Thornycroft built a steam-powered dust cart for the Chiswick Urban District Council. Front-wheel drive, rear-wheel steering, a marine launch-type boiler, a twin-cylinder compound engine. He exhibited a 1-ton steam van at the Crystal Palace show. He formed the Thornycroft Steam Wagon Company, and London's first powered bus, a Thornycroft steam double-decker, ran on streets that had never heard anything louder than a horse. The Chiswick yard couldn't contain it. Torpedo boats were getting longer. Lorry orders were rising. The Thames was a bottleneck. In September 1898, after surveying several sites, Thornycroft purchased a 16-acre tract on Worting Road in Basingstoke, Hampshire, a quiet market town on the London and South Western Railway, with good road and rail links to London, Southampton and the southwest. The site was open land on the western edge of a town whose population barely registered on the national census. Nobody in Basingstoke could have known what had just arrived at their doorstep. Nobody could have guessed that the quiet purchase of 16 acres by a London boat builder would, within 2 decades, make Worting Road the beating heart of the town, and keep it beating for the next 70 years. Chapter 2. Steel on the Worting Road. The Basingstoke works were operational within months. By 1899, Thornycroft steam wagons were being supplied to the British Army for the first time, initially for the Second Boer War, where they hauled supplies across the veldt alongside horse-drawn transport that was already looking obsolete. In 1901, Thornycroft's lorries won the War Office's heavy lorry competition outright. The military connection that would define the firm for the next 6 decades was forged before the century had turned. The first internal combustion Thornycroft motor vehicle followed in 1902, a 4-tonner, and for a decade the firm produced quality petrol cars alongside its commercial vehicles. They were handsome machines, built to the same tolerances as the marine engines. But in 1913, with quiet deliberation, the board abandoned car production entirely to concentrate on commercial vehicles. It was one of those decisions that, in retrospect, defined everything. Thornycroft would never build a private car again. The future was lorries, buses, and the military. 6 years later, the shipyard followed the lorry works out of London. In 1904, Chiswick was vacated and the marine business relocated to Woolston on the River Itchen at Southampton, because torpedo boats and destroyers had outgrown the Thames, just as lorries had outgrown the yard. From that point on, the Thornycroft family ran 2 great works in Hampshire, ships at Woolston, lorries at Basingstoke, 2 rivers of production flowing from the same source. Sir John himself was knighted in the 1902 coronation honours. He took a doctorate from Glasgow, was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, and served on the Admiralty Committee of Design under Lord Fisher, the committee that in 1904 recommended Parsons turbines for the revolutionary Dreadnought class of battleships. By the time he retired around 1911, his name was on warships, lorries, torpedo boats, and a 16-acre factory that was rapidly becoming the largest employer in Basingstoke. He lived his final years between Ayotte Villa on Chiswick Mall and Stane House at Bembridge, where he and Blanche kept testing hulls in the family tank. He died at Bembridge on the 28th of June, 1928, aged 85. The sculptor's son had built an empire that stretched from the Thames to the Itchen to the Worting Road, and the Worting Road was only just getting started. The signature product of the pre-war era was the J-type. Designed to meet the 1911 War Office subsidy scheme specification, it was a 3-ton lorry powered by a 6,256 cc 4-cylinder side-valve petrol engine producing 45 brake horsepower through a 4-speed gearbox. Solid, dependable, built to a military standard that valued reliability above everything else. From August 1914, the War Office settled on the J-type as one of its principal subsidy vehicles. Over 5,000 were delivered to the British military during the Great War, hauling ammunition, rations, and men across the churned landscapes of France and Flanders. Some were shipped to Imperial forces overseas. 183 were fitted with the QF 13-pounder 600-weight anti-aircraft gun, turning the reliable 3-tonner into a self-propelled anti-aircraft platform that could follow the infantry. The Basingstoke works during 1914–18 wasn't simply building lorries. It was building a war. Marine engines for coastal motorboats being assembled at Woolston, trench mortars, more than 3,000 depth charge throwers for the Admiralty, shells, many thousands of torpedo rudders. By the middle of the war, around 1,550 people were employed at Basingstoke. Roughly 550 of them were women, 35% of the workforce. Women who had never set foot inside a factory were now machining depth charge components and assembling military lorries alongside men who'd been doing it for a decade. The post-war years brought a familiar slump. Ex-military J-types flooded the second-hand market at prices the factory couldn't match, and the order book thinned. But the 1924 War Office subsidy scheme, £120 per approved vehicle, kept Thornycroft's military connection alive. The A1 RSW six-wheeler of 1926 was built specifically to meet the new subsidy specification. And then came the naming. From 1931, every Thornycroft lorry and bus received an evocative name, and the Worting Road Works became a menagerie of heavy iron. The Sturdy, the Trusty, the Nippy, the Bulldog, Hardy, Dandy, Mastiff, Stag, Jupiter, Iron Duke, Bullfinch. Six-wheelers like the QC Dreadnought, a 12-ton rigid six that could haul anything the roads would carry. The Hathi of 1924, a 4x4 with an 11.3-litre straight six and aluminium axle casings, designed for the Indian Army and the Sudan. Buses called the Lightning, the Beauty Ride, the Daring, the Signet, the Boadicea, the Patrician. By 1932, there were more than 40 commercial vehicle and bus chassis in the catalogue. The Great Western Railway became the single largest fleet buyer, but the range was too wide. The company's bank said so, bluntly. In the early 1930s, Thornycroft was loss-making and overextended, 11 different lorry models, plus buses, plus marine engines. Employment fell from 1,800 in 1930 to just 731 by 1936. Rationalisation saved the firm. The slow climb of military rearmament saved it further. By the late 1930s, Basingstoke was profitable again and central to British rearmament, building the machines that would be needed when the next war arrived. It arrived on the 3rd of September, 1939, and the works on Worting Road was ready. Chapter 3. The Works goes to war. During the Second World War, the Basingstoke factory ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, around 2,500 employees, over 800 of them women. The production figures from this period are staggering, even at a distance of 80 years. Approximately 5,000 Nubian 4x4 3-tonners, a new design drawn up in 1939 with the War Department that would become one of the standard British military medium lorries of the war. Around 4,000 Tata 6x4s between 1938 and 1945, 1,500 sturdy 4x2 trucks, 672-pounder guns, 1,700 17-pounder anti-tank guns, the weapon that could kill a Tiger tank at 1,000 yards, over 8,000 Bren gun carriers and universal carriers, 15,000 sets of torpedo parts, and several thousand 9.5-inch depth charge throwers. The commercial motor of the 30th of March, 1945, noted explicitly that women workers were mainly responsible for the production and testing of these depth charge throwers. The same hands that had never touched a lathe before 1939 were now machining the weapons that protected Atlantic convoys from U-boats. Basingstoke wasn't building components. It was building the means of national survival. And then there was the Terrapin. Britain's answer to the American DUKW, an 8x8 amphibious cargo vehicle powered by twin Ford V8s, designed to carry supplies across rivers and flooded terrain in the European theatre. It was conceived at Basingstoke, tested on the Basingstoke Canal, and deployed in the crossing of the Rhine. Not the most famous amphibian of the war, but proof that the Worting Road Works could design from scratch as well as produce to order. The factory itself sat on the south side of Worting Road, just west of the town centre. Aerial photographs from 1928, held by Historic England's Britain from Above archive, show a sprawl of large pitched roof assembly shops, a long machine shop, foundry buildings and railway sidings, fed by a spur from the Basingstoke and Alton Light Railway. A specialist shunting locomotive, a G6 tank engine, moved wagons between the Basingstoke goods yard and the factory's own sidings. A gantry hoist for moving chassis stood near the entrance. Rows of finished lorry chassis would be wheeled out in the open yard for completion, and any worker arriving for the morning shift would hear the works before they saw it. The hammer of pneumatic riveters carrying across the yard. The howl of large planing machines. The firm had bought a 25-foot-long, 10-foot-wide double planing machine from George Richards and Company of Broadheath back in 1905, capable of working an 8-foot depth of cast iron, and the descendants of that machine were still cutting metal 40 years later. The clatter of the chassis press. The foundry fume drifting across Worting Road. The smell of cellulose paint from the finishing bays. And underneath it all, the baseline vibration of a 16-acre site producing weapons and vehicles around the clock. A hum that got into the bones of the buildings and never quite left, not even on the rare occasions when a shift changeover left a momentary gap in the noise. 2,500 people, sharing a single purpose, for 6 years. The works dominated a town whose total population was little more than 13,000 at the outbreak of war. When the hooter sounded at shift change, the streets around Worting Road filled with men and women in overalls, heading home to the terraced housing in Sarum Hill, Burgess Road, and along Worting Road itself, streets that had been built largely for industrial workers and that owed their existence to the factory at the end of the road. The war ended, the workers went home, and the Basingstoke works turned from military survival to something even more ambitious. Chapter 4. The Fortress of Heavy Steel. Post-war, Thornycroft simplified. The bewildering 40-model catalogue of the 1930s was gone. In its place came a focused range aimed squarely at the heavy and specialist end of the market. The nippy 3-tonner, the sturdy 5 to 6-tonner, the Amazon 12-tonner, and the trusty 15-tonner in 1948. Then the Trident Export 6-wheeler 12-tonner in 1950. Then the Big Ben in 1953, an 11.3-litre, 155 brake horsepower, 6x4 and 6x6 oilfield prime mover, designed to a specification from the oil company's Materiel Committee. Thornycroft wasn't trying to compete with the volume producers anymore. It was building the machines that nobody else could build, the heaviest, the toughest, the most specialised vehicles on British roads and on roads that weren't roads at all. In 1948, the company name changed to Transport Equipment, Thornycroft Ltd, separating the road vehicle business from the marine side, which would later merge with Vosper in 1966. The name was clumsy. Nobody outside the trade ever called it anything but Thornycroft, but the intent was clear. The lorry business was its own enterprise now, standing on its own reputation. And what a reputation it was building. The Nubian Airport fire crash tender, a 4-wheel drive machine with a 6-wheel drive Mk2 option that competitors simply couldn't match, became the standard equipment at airfields across the Commonwealth. The Big Ben hauled pipe sections across the Iraqi and Libyan deserts. The Mastiff, with its forward control fiberglass reinforced cab, pushed into markets where conventional bonneted lorries couldn't operate. Thornycroft's own 6-speed constant mesh gearbox was engineered to such quality that it would later be adopted as standard across AEC and the medium-weight Leyland and Albion ranges, a piece of Basingstoke engineering driving lorries that wore other companies' badges. But it was the airport crash tenders that earned the works a particular kind of quiet pride. When a plane came down, the first vehicle to reach the wreckage was often a Nubian. The 6-wheel drive variant could cross terrain that would stop anything else: soft ground, mud, debris fields, the churned earth at the edge of a runway. The crews who operated them trusted them absolutely, because a crash tender that gets stuck is a crash tender that costs lives. Thornycroft understood this. The vehicles were built with the same tolerances that had gone into depth charge throwers and torpedo parts, military precision applied to civilian emergency. Every Nubian that left the Worting Road Assembly Hall carried with it the accumulated knowledge of 50 years of building machines that could not be allowed to fail. Imagine the Basingstoke works in the mid-1950s, a workforce of around 1,500, the foundry casting engine blocks and gearbox housings, the machine shop cutting them to tolerance, the assembly halls fitting Rolls-Royce engines into Antar chassis and Thornycroft diesels into Big Bens, the paint shop finishing vehicles in desert sand, military olive drab, fire engine red. The test track behind the works, where drivers put completed vehicles through their paces before they were loaded onto railway wagons or driven out through the gates. The town had grown, but Thornycroft was still at its heart. Even after the post-war arrival of Eli Lilly, Lansing Bagnall and Kelvin Bottomley and Baird, later Smith's Industries, 4 employers between them accounted for roughly a third of Basingstoke's working population. Thornycroft was the largest of the 4. The streets nearest the factory told the story. The terraced housing in Sarum Hill and Burgess Road was home to families who'd worked at the factory for 2 and sometimes 3 generations. The firm had its own works football club, Thornycroft Athletic FC, founded in the early 20th century. Multi-generation families were common on the books. Fathers brought sons, uncles brought nephews. The apprenticeship culture was strong enough that leaving Thornycroft for another employer felt, to some, like a small act of disloyalty. Gary Bone, a long-serving Thornycroft fitter who would later co-found the Thornycroft Society, described a workforce that regard their time there fondly. That word, fondly, carries weight. It wasn't fondness for the wages, which were competitive but not exceptional. It was fondness for the work itself. These were people who built things that mattered, lorries that went to war, crash tenders that saved lives, prime movers that hauled pipe across deserts. When a Thornycroft left the factory gate, the workers knew where it was going and what it would do. The connection between the hand that built it and the purpose it served was direct, tangible, and understood. R.F. Newman, born in Bembridge on the Isle of Wight in 1893, a marine engineer by training who'd come up through the Thornycroft system, was the managing director who presided over this period. The wider board still contained members of the family. Sir John Edward Thornycroft, the founder's eldest son, remained chairman until the 20th of July 1960, when he resigned at the age of 88. He died 4 months later, on the 21st of November 1960. His son, John Ward Thornycroft, stepped up to the chairmanship, the 3rd generation, the last family chairman, arriving at the top just as the storm clouds began to gather over Worting Road. Chapter 5. The mighty Antar, the undisputed peak of Thornycroft's reputation, arrived in the form of one vehicle, and the story of how it came to exist begins not in Basingstoke, but in the deserts of Iraq. In 1949, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, later British Petroleum, needed a machine that could haul 60-foot oil pipeline sections from desert railheads across terrain where no conventional lorry could survive. The distances were vast. The loads were enormous. The heat was murderous. They went to Thornycroft, and Thornycroft designed a vehicle in 9 months that would stay in production for 2 decades and in military service for over 3. They called it the mighty Antar. The name was a deliberately flattering reference to Antar ibn Shaddad, a pre-Islamic Arab poet-warrior, the kind of subtle commercial gesture that a London-based engineering firm of the 1940s knew how to make when courting Middle Eastern oil money. The gesture worked. The first batch went to the Iraq Petroleum Company for the 560-mile Esso pipeline. The engine was the centerpiece, the Rolls-Royce Meteorite, an 18.4-litre overhead cam V8, derived from the V12 Meteor used in Centurion and Conqueror tanks, which was itself a D-rated version of the Merlin aero engine that had powered Spitfires and Lancasters. 285 brake horsepower at 2,000 RPM, built under license by Rover. The same family of engines that had won the Battle of Britain, scaled down and civilianized, sitting in the bonnet of a 6x4 tractor unit designed to drag 60 tons of steel pipe across a desert. The British Army took notice almost immediately. From 1951, the FV 12001 tractor, 30-ton GS, 6x4, entered service as a fixed steel-bodied ballast tractor, paired with the Dyson FV 3601 50-ton trailer to carry the new Centurion main battle tank. Earlier plans for a wider, even heavier transporter, the Leyland FV 1000, intended for the Conqueror, were cancelled as the Antar proved it could do the job. The Antar simply replaced the American Diamond T that had soldiered through the Desert War. Worting Road had built the successor to an American legend. The MK2, produced between 1953 and 55, gained a 20-ton winch, a saddled fifth wheel, and a 60-ton semi-trailer. The Mk3 of the early 1960s replaced the wide-bonneted Meteorite with a slimmer Rolls-Royce C8 SFL, a 16.2-litre supercharged inline-8 diesel producing 333 brake horsepower at 2,100 RPM. It was road-tested at all-up weights of 126 tonnes with a Chieftain main battle tank on the back. 126 tonnes, controlled by one driver, built in a market town in Hampshire. The Antar's military presence was global. By the late 1950s, it was the standard tank transporter of 7 Tank Transporter Regiment, Royal Corps of Transport, with squadrons based at Sennelager, Fallingbostel, and Hamm in West Germany, the British Army of the Rhine, and 19 Squadron at Bulford in England. It served in the Suez Crisis. It served in Aden. It served in Borneo. It hauled centurions and chieftains across Salisbury Plain and through the forests of northern Germany in every major Cold War exercise for 3 decades. 3 Antars went to Australia in 1953 for the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme, hauling more than 20,000 tonnes of plant and equipment to dam and power station sites in the Australian Alps. The original rover-built petrol meteorites were replaced in 1960 with Rolls-Royce C6 TFL diesel units, producing 300 brake horsepower, because the Australians worked the machines so hard that the petrol engines couldn't keep pace. Civilian Antars hauled pipe in Libya, Qatar, Oman, Iran, Argentina, and across North Africa. A total of 736 by 4 Antar units were ultimately built. The press was reverential. The commercial motor of the 12th of September, 1958, ran a 6-page technical feature on the new MA Antar. The 6th of February, 1959 issue covered Thornycroft increase oil field range, the Big Ben 6x6 Sandmaster riding on 1800 by 25 sand tyres and Michelin X Sahara rubber, built for the Libyan Fezzan, and Dinky Toys produced a 1-43 mighty Antar tank transporter in miniature that became one of the best-selling die-cast toys of the 1950s and 60s. Children across Britain pushed a tiny Antar across their bedroom carpets, without knowing that the real thing was hauling 50-ton tanks across a real desert 4,000 miles away. Chapter 6. The Summit. Stand at the gates of the Worting Road Works in 1958, and what you're looking at is a company that has found its purpose. The bewildering catalogue of the 30s is gone. The wartime surge has settled into a focused, profitable operation, building the heaviest and most specialised vehicles in Britain. The Antar Mk2 is in service with the British Army and BAOR. Civilian Antars are working the Iraqi and Libyan deserts. The Big Ben is hauling oil field equipment across terrain that would destroy any conventional lorry. The Nubian crash tender is the standard equipment at airfields across the Commonwealth. R.F. Newman is managing director. John Ward Thornycroft has just succeeded his father as chairman. The workforce stands around 1,500. The Thornycroft 6-speed constant mesh gearbox is so good that AEC and Albion have adopted it for their own medium weight ranges. The commercial motor of the 24th of August, 1962, would list 4 Thornycroft specials for the Earl's Court Motor Show, the Mighty Antar, Big Ben, and 2 Nubian variants, each one a machine that no other British manufacturer could build to the same standard. The works had a quality that the dossier calls fortress, and the word fits, but only for this period. Basingstoke in the late 50s wasn't trying to be everything to everyone. It was doing a small number of things at a level that nobody else could match. Heavy military haulage, oil field prime movers, airport crash tenders, specialist gearboxes, 4 product lines, each one world-class, each one earning the loyalty of customers who could not afford failure. The British Army, the oil companies, the airfield fire services. Thornycroft wasn't the largest commercial vehicle manufacturer in Britain. It wasn't trying to be. It was the one you went to when the load was too heavy, the terrain too harsh, or the consequences of breakdown too catastrophic for anything less. Sir John Edward Thornycroft resigned the chairmanship of the parent company on the 20th of July 1960. He was 88 years old. He had overseen both the Southampton shipyard relocation and the building of the Basingstoke motorworks. He had watched the J-Type go to war, the factory turned to 24-hour production in 1939, and the mighty Antar become the standard tank transporter of the British Army. He died 4 months later, on the 21st of November. His son, John Ward, stepped into the chairmanship, the third generation of Thornycrofts on the board of a company their grandfather had founded in a sculptor's studio. The works was profitable. The products were world-class. The military and the oil companies were buying. The workforce was loyal, skilled, and settled. Everything that a family business needed to endure was in place. And at that exact moment, the moment of succession, the moment of apparent security, the British commercial vehicle industry began to eat itself. The new motorway network had arrived with the M1 in 1959. British Railways was nationalised. Rising volume markets favoured the few manufacturers who could spread tooling costs across tens of thousands of vehicles. Specialists like Thornycroft, building 700 Antars over 2 decades, couldn't generate the margins that the volume producers demanded. The logic of consolidation was gathering force. John Ward Thornycroft would be the last member of the family to chair the company. The decisions that would destroy Basingstoke were already being discussed in boardrooms he'd never been invited to enter. Chapter 7. The Takeover. By 1960, the British truck industry was consolidating with a speed that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The new motorway network demanded volume. British Railways' nationalisation had reshaped freight logistics. Rising costs favoured manufacturers who could spread tooling across tens of thousands of vehicles a year. For a specialist builder producing 700 Antars over 2 decades and a few hundred crash tenders per annum, the arithmetic was brutal. The market didn't care that Thornycroft's products were world-class. It cared about unit cost. AEC, Associated Equipment Company, long dominant in the London bus market, aggressive and expanding, had been building an empire of its own through its holding company, Associated Commercial Vehicles. ACV already owned Park Royal, Maudslay, and Crossley. It wanted machining capacity. Basingstoke had machining capacity. The logic was clean. On the 1st of March, 1961, ACV acquired transport equipment, Thornycroft Ltd. The Commercial Motors Report of the 10th of February, 1961, is the key primary document. Sir William Black, chairman of AEC, and R.F. Newman, managing director of Thornycroft, made the formal announcement. Newman's words, that it was sad to be no longer a child of John the Fir Thornycroft, dull-entered, but equally elating to be a child of AEC, carry the cadence of resignation dressed as celebration. A man who had spent his career building Thornycroft's identity was now explaining, to the trade press and to his own workforce, why surrendering that identity was good news. Black was blunter about the commercial logic. Undoubtedly, he told the press, the prime reason for the ACV takeover is the additional machining capacity which acquisition of the Thornycroft factories at Basingstoke and Reading will give. Not the Antar, not the Nubian, not the Big Ben, not 70 years of specialist engineering, machining capacity. Basingstoke had been bought for its machine tools, not its products. Lord Brabazon, chairman of ACV, told the company's annual general meeting that Thornycroft is a great name in the engineering world. We intend that Thornycroft shall remain a great name in road transport. Newman was promised that current production, the Antar, Big Ben, Nubian, and Mastiff, would continue under the Thornycroft name. He was warned, however, that lighter Thornycrofts would be rationalised out of the range. The specialist heavy end would survive. The rest would go. The promises were sincere. In the 5th of January, 1962 issue of the Commercial Motor, page 42, ACV announced a £1 million re-equipment plan for the Basingstoke works, major new machine tools for the heavy vehicle business. 1 million of new plant for Thornycroft works, the headline read, fresh capital for fresh production. Basingstoke was being invested in, not wound down. The Earl's Court Show lineup for that year included a 333 brake horsepower Rolls-Royce engined Antar, 3 Nubians, and a Big Ben, all proudly wearing the Thornycroft badge. ACV's own annual report described Basingstoke as a specialist arm of the new conglomerate. £1 million. New plant. A future. The announcement was 5 months old when it became meaningless. Chapter 8. The Geometry of Destruction. In June 1962, Leyland Motors acquired Associated Commercial Vehicles. The terms were a direct one-for-one exchange of Leyland £1 ordinary shares for ACV £1 ordinary shares, valuing the deal at £18,273,025. Sir Henry Spurrier of Leyland framed the acquisition as a response to the challenge of world competition. Spurrier remained Leyland chairman. Stanley Markland was deputy chairman, and the man who was appointed managing director of Leyland Motors in September 1962 was Donald Stokes. That name matters more than any other in the Thornycroft story after the founders. Stokes had been appointed managing director of Scammell Lorries at Watford in July 1960, 2 years before the Leyland takeover of ACV. Scammell was Leyland's traditional specialist vehicle arm: pioneer tank transporters, articulated lorries, oil-field prime movers, the same categories of vehicle that Thornycroft built at Basingstoke. Stokes knew Scammell's capability. He knew its people. He knew its factory. He had spent 2 years running it before the ACV deal dropped Thornycroft into his lap. The structural fact behind everything that followed is this. From June 1962, the Leyland Motor Corporation contained 2 specialist heavy vehicle works doing substantially the same work: Basingstoke, building the Antar, Big Ben, and Nubian; Watford, building the Scammell Constructor, Mountaineer, and later the Crusader. 2 factories, 2 workforces, 2 sets of overheads, overlapping ranges. From a corporate perspective, the rational answer was to concentrate specialist production at one of the 2. The answer Leyland gave was Watford. Not immediately, not dramatically, not in a single boardroom confrontation that could be filmed for the documentary. The Thornycroft kill was something more banal and more devastating: structural marginalization through a series of small decisions, each one defensible on the day it was made, none of them individually fatal, all of them pointing in the same direction. The first was badge erosion. The very logic of the ACV takeover had been that lighter Thornycrofts would be rationalized. That happened. ACV transferred production of the AEC dump truck to Basingstoke, a small win for the works, a few extra jobs on the assembly line. But in return, the Thornycroft 6-speed constant mesh gearbox, that beautifully engineered component that had been Basingstoke's intellectual property, migrated across to AEC, Albion, and Leyland medium trucks. The knowledge flowed out. The badge stayed, but the gearbox now drove vehicles that said AEC on the bonnet. By 1964, the last vehicles built under the Thornycroft name were the Nubian 6x6 airport crash tenders. After that, anything leaving Basingstoke wore AEC or Leyland badges, or was rebadged as Scammell. The name that had been cast on tens of thousands of lorries since 1896 disappeared from new vehicles 11 years before the factory closed. The second decision was the Scammell preference. This is where Stokes's biography becomes the connective tissue. A managing director who had run Scammell at Watford for 2 years was now overseeing a group that contained both Scammell and Thornycroft. The 2 firms made similar products for similar customers. One of them was the firm Stokes had managed personally. The other was an acquisition that had arrived inside an acquisition. There is no evidence that Donald Stokes bore personal animus toward Thornycroft. There didn't need to be. When investment decisions were made, when production was allocated, when the group's specialist vehicle strategy was drawn up, the factory whose managing director was now running the entire corporation had an advantage that no amount of engineering excellence could overcome: familiarity, trust, habit, the quiet gravity of a workplace you know. Stokes was knighted in 1965. In January 1968, prodded by Tony Benn at the Industrial Reorganisation Corporation and by Harold Wilson personally, Leyland merged with British Motor Holdings to form the British Leyland Motor Corporation. Stokes became chairman and chief executive on the 17th of January 1968. Thornycroft was now 4 corporate steps removed from its founders: inside British Leyland, inside Leyland Motor Corporation, inside ACV, inside what had once been an independent Hampshire works, one of more than 10 lorry brands in a conglomerate that also contained Standard Triumph, Rover, Jaguar, and the entire Austin Morris car operation. The specialist lorry builder from Worting Road was a decimal point on a balance sheet that stretched from Longbridge to Cowley to Solihull. The £1 million re-equipment that ACV had announced in January 1962, the new machine tools, the fresh capital, the promise of a future, had been rendered meaningless 6 months later by the Leyland takeover. The capital that had been earmarked for Hampshire heavy vehicle production was now in the gift of a board whose own specialist factory was at Watford. Nothing was personally vindictive. Nothing had to be. The geometry of the group did the work. The third decision was the one that stopped the heart. Vehicle production at Basingstoke ceased in 1969. The commercial motor of the 12th of January, 1973, recorded the transfer in the language of corporate rationalization. Specialist vehicle production, most notably the Nubian heavy dump truck and the LD 55 6x4 dump truck, was moved north to Watford. The phrase used in trade press accounts was that Thornycroft had been absorbed into the vast mass of Leyland. Inside the company, the transfer was framed as straightforward industrial rationalization. In Basingstoke, it meant the assembly halls went dark. Workers were nominally offered transfers to Watford. Many did not move. Scammell was on the far side of London, and Basingstoke families were rooted, 2 and sometimes 3 generations deep in Sarum Hill and Burgess Road, with children in local schools and wives working at Eli Lilly or Smith's Industries. A transfer to Watford wasn't a change of workplace, it was a change of life. Most stayed. Most found other work in a town that, by the late 1960s, was expanding faster than at any point in its history. But they weren't building Thornycrofts anymore, and nobody at Watford was building them either. Chapter 9. The Army That Waited. The fourth decision, the one that reveals the strategic cost of everything Leyland had done, played out not in any boardroom, but in the tank parks and transport yards of the British Army. The mighty Antar had entered service in 1951. It was the standard tank transporter of 7 Tank Transporter Regiment, Royal Corps of Transport. Squadrons at Senelager, Fallingbostel and Ham depended on it to move centurions and chieftains to and from exercises, depots and docksides across the British Army of the Rhine. 19 Squadron at Bulford depended on it at home. The Basingstoke factory that built the Antar closed for vehicle production in 1969. The Antar Emmerkade III was the most recent variant. No replacement was in development. The spares pipeline, fed from a factory that now made gearboxes instead of lorries, began to thin. The British Army kept using the Antar anyway. It had no choice. The replacement, the Scammell Commander, was developed between 1976 and 1978, but it was not delivered to the Army until the 30th of March, 1984. Only 125 units were built between 1983 and 85. The Ministry of Defence nearly cancelled the project entirely in February 1982, under budget pressure from the Falklands mobilisation. 15 years. From the closure of the Basingstoke assembly lines in 1969 to the delivery of the first commander in 1984, the British Army's tank transporter squadrons were kept waiting, maintained on an ageing fleet of Antar Merc-3s, supported by an ever-thinning spare parts pipeline, because the Leyland decision to close Thornycroft's production capability had left the Army's principal tank transport customer without a domestic manufacturer. The Antars soldiered on into the mid-1980s, patched, repaired, kept running by the regimental workshops at Bulford and across Bayore, long after their design life had ended. 730 Antars had been built in total. The last of them were still hauling chieftains when the Scammell Commander finally arrived to replace them, 33 years after the first Antar had entered service, and 15 years after the factory that built them had been silenced. The customer had kept buying. The supplier had been killed. That gap, a decade and a half of patched-up Antars, is the quietest and most damning evidence of what the Leyland rationalization actually cost. Not in balance sheet terms, not in share price terms, in operational terms. The British Army of the Rhine depended on a vehicle whose manufacturer had been dismantled for reasons of internal group geometry, and nobody inside the Leyland Empire thought to ask whether the customer might have had a view on the matter. Chapter 10. The Gearbox and the Supermarket. After vehicle production ceased in 1969, the Worting Road factory continued, but as something unrecognisable. The assembly halls that had built Antars and Nubians and Big Bens were now a heavy gearbox works inside British Leyland. Thornycroft's 6-speed and 9 and 10-speed range-change gearboxes were still standard fit across AEC, Albion and Leyland trucks. The skills were there. The machine tools were there. The workforce was there, between 1,000 and 1,200 people, still clocking in through the same gates on Worting Road. But nothing with a Thornycroft badge, or any badge at all, rolled out under its own power. 3 years of gearboxes. Then the final sale. In December 1972, British Leyland sold the Basingstoke works to Eaton Corporation of Ohio for £5 million. The Times reported it on the 19th of December. The Commercial Motor covered it on the 12th of January 1973. Eaton, already a major axle producer, added the Thornycroft heavy gearbox facility to its transmission operations. The workforce was reduced from 1,100 to 738 as part of the transition. The difference, around 360 jobs, was the redundancy that the deals pledged to employ them in its transmission business, disguised in optimistic language. The works changed hands on the 14th of January 1973. So ended Thornycroft as a vehicle manufacturer. The last lorry had been built in 1972, an Aveling Barford dumper, according to the Commercial Motors retrospective. Not a Thornycroft, not an Antar or a Nubian or a Big Ben. An Aveling Barford dumper wearing someone else's name, assembled on a production line that had once turned out the standard tank transporter of the British Army. The final vehicle to leave the factory where the J-type had been born, where 5,000 Nubians had been built for the war, where the mighty Antar had been designed in 9 months and served for 33 years, was a dumper truck badged for a subsidiary of a subsidiary. Eaton operated the Worting Road site as a gearbox works through the 1970s and into the 80s. The buildings aged, the workforce thinned. The gantry hoist still stood near the entrance, but the yard where rows of finished lorry chassis had once been wheeled out for completion was quiet. In the late 1980s, the works were demolished. The cleared 16-acre site was redeveloped as the Thornycroft Industrial Estate. A Morrison's supermarket became its anchor occupant. Light industrial units filled the remaining acreage. Across Churchill Way West, the Thornycroft roundabout still carries the name, a piece of 1970s ring road infrastructure named, in an unconscious act of irony, for the firm whose factory the ring road had been built to bypass. The poignancy sharpens when you consider what was happening to Basingstoke around it. The 1961 London Overspill Town Development Agreement had designated the town as an expanded town, like Harlow, Stevenage and Swindon, intended to receive Londoners and London industry relocated to the southeast. Between 1961 and 1977, local employment in Basingstoke grew from 13,000 to 43,000. As Thornycroft contracted, the rest of the town exploded outward. A new ring road, a new central shopping centre, new estates at Brighton Hill, Hatch Warren, Chineyham. The Worting Road site, once on the western edge of a quiet market town, was absorbed into the urban core of a town that no longer needed it and had already moved on. The general fate of British heavy truck manufacturing follows the same shape drawn at Basingstoke, repeated across the country. The AEC factory at Southall, the firm that had bought Thornycroft in 1961, closed in 1979. Scammell at Watford, the factory that had inherited Thornycroft's work, the one Leyland had chosen to keep, closed in 1988. Foden built its last lorry in 2006. ERF was bought by MAN AG and the brand discontinued. Atkinson was absorbed by Seddon, absorbed by ERF. Of the great names that had stood at the 1958 Earl's Court Show, AEC, Albion, Atkinson, Bedford, Dennis, ERF, Foden, Guy, Leyland, Maudslay, Scammell, Seddon, Thornycroft, only Leyland, under American ownership, and Dennis, in specialist municipal vehicles, still manufacture in the United Kingdom. Scammell at Watford, the factory Leyland chose over Basingstoke, the winner of the rationalisation. Closed 1988, 19 years after Thornycroft. The preference that killed Basingstoke didn't even save Watford. Leyland's geometry destroyed both. Chapter 11. What the Silence Keeps. Walk the Thornycroft Industrial Estate today, and there is almost nothing left. The Morrison's car park covers ground where the assembly halls stood. The light industrial units occupy the footprint of the foundry and the machine shop. A gantry hoist, salvaged from the factory before demolition, stands at the entrance to the supermarket. A single piece of steelwork, rusted and unexplained, that most shoppers walk past without a second look. A few hundred yards away, across the Basingstoke Leisure Park, Milestones Museum holds what was saved. The Hampshire Museum Service began acquiring Thornycroft material in the late 1970s, partly because the closure had been so total that without rescue effort, the records would have been pulped. The collection grew, production records, family papers, photographs, brochures, machine tools and vehicles. Hampshire County Council and Basingstoke and Dean Borough Council built a purpose-built museum to house it all. It opened on the 1st of December 2000 on the site of the old leisure park, a few hundred yards from where the factory had stood. The museum now holds the most comprehensive Thornycroft collection in public hands: a 1903 four-seater car, a 1905 14-horsepower open tourer, a 1916 J-type 3-ton army lorry in War Department livery, the vehicle that hauled the British Expeditionary Force across France, a 1917 J-type in Scots livery, a 1919 J-type Portsmouth Corporation bus, a 1925 A1 lorry in Shell livery, a part-built 1935 Lightning coach displayed in half-finished condition to show its construction, frozen in mid-assembly, as if the worker who was building it simply stepped away one afternoon and never came back, and a 1971 Nubian airport crash tender, registration YMY 432H, one of the last vehicles to carry the engineering DNA of the Worting Road Works. The J-type number, 14201, still runs. It is driven at commemorative events. Its 6,256 cc four-cylinder side-valve engine firing on petrol more than a century after it was designed to haul ammunition across Flanders. The sound it makes, a slow, mechanical heartbeat, unhurried and certain, is the sound of Basingstoke in 1915, carried forward by people who refused to let it fall silent. The Thornycroft Society was founded in 1991. Gary Bone, the long-serving fitter who remembered the works fondly, was among its founding directors. They operate from Clydesdon Village Hall, a short distance from the original factory site, and they run an annual Thornycroft vehicle rally in Basingstoke. Around 20 preserved Antars survive in private collections across Britain, kept on the road by enthusiasts who understand what it takes to maintain an 18.4-litre Rolls-Royce Meteorite engine that hasn't been manufactured in half a century. The Thornycroft name itself survived, though it took a complicated route. The marine engine business, the original Thornycroft heritage, from John Isaac's first hull on the Thames, passed through Beans Engineering, a British Leyland subsidiary at Tipton, got caught up in the collapse of Reliant Motors and survived a 1995 management buyout as Thornycroft Engines Ltd. Today, they build marinized diesel engines based on small-capacity Kubota units, mainly for canal narrowboats. The shipbuilding side, separated formally in 1948, merged with Vosper in 1966 to form Vosper Thornycroft, was nationalised at Woolston in 1977, returned to private ownership in 1986, and continues today as VT Group. The sculptor's son's name still moves through water. It just doesn't move across land anymore. What remains at Worting Road is a supermarket, a roundabout, and a rusted gantry hoist that nobody explains. What remains at Milestones is a museum visited by 102,505 people in 2025, some of whom walk through a recreated section of a factory they never saw, past vehicles they never rode in, into a silence that isn't quite the right shape for the space it fills. And what remains in the gap between 1969 and 1984, the 15 years when the British Army's tank transporter squadrons nursed their ageing Antars through exercise after exercise, waiting for a replacement that the closure of Basingstoke had made impossible to deliver, is the truest measure of what was lost. Not the buildings. Buildings can be replaced. Not the brand. Brands can be revived. The knowledge. The accumulated understanding of how to build a machine that could haul 126 tons across Salisbury Plain and not fail. The institutional memory carried in the hands of 1,500 workers who knew, without consulting a manual, how a Rolls-Royce Meteorite mated to a Thornycroft 6-speed gearbox, how a Nubian chassis flexed over rough ground without cracking, how a Big Ben could be stripped and rebuilt in a desert workshop with hand tools and ingenuity. That knowledge lived in a 16-acre factory on the Worting Road. It couldn't be transferred to Watford in a memo. It couldn't be captured in a blueprint. It walked out through the gates when the workers were told there was nothing left to build, and it never came back. 74 years on the Worting Road. From the sculptor's son's steam wagons to the mighty Antar, from the J-types of the Somme to the crash tenders that reached burning aircraft before anything else could. A quiet, extraordinary accumulation of heavy engineering skill, passed from hand to hand across 3 generations, in a market town that grew up around its factory, and then, when the factory was gone, grew over the place where it had stood. Not through one catastrophe, through a sequence of acquisitions: ACV in 1961, Leyland in 1962, British Leyland in 1968, each one moving the decisions a little further from Hampshire, each one shifting the balance a little more toward Watford, until the fortress on the Worting Road was empty, and the silence that followed was the only thing left that Leyland couldn't rationalise away.